All right, good morning, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm so glad you're here today. Happy Friday. I want to express my appreciation to our guest today, Dr. Park Dietz. Thank you so much for joining us. Park, we're glad to have you here. Just for reference, my prior life was spent in human resources. And we were just talking a second ago, Dr. Dietz was brought in to talk to us about how to prevent violence in the workplace easily 20 years ago. He's absolutely a towering, world-renowned expert in this field, and I'm delighted to have you on our program. Thank you so much, Dr. Dietz.
Thank you, Donna, for having me.
Of course, of course. All right, so guys, we're going to be in webinar format today. Please do introduce yourselves on chat, and I mean it. Let's go ahead and connect with each other. For those of you who are new with us today, which there are some, Purse Power Quickly is working to help women use their massive purchasing power to drive positive change. Women make 80% of all purchasing decisions. We believe that if women would choose to buy from the companies that actively promote women, and we would do it in mass, and if we could create a funding stream for battered women's shelters in the process, we could shatter glass ceilings and change lives. So that's what we're trying to accomplish with these programs. The purpose of the call is to connect female entrepreneurs across the country with each other and with world-renowned experts. We're trying to support you during this difficult time, and I know that this is going to be a fascinating program. I'm excited to have Dr. Dietz here. I want to shout out to our special guests. I saw that Jennifer Grigsby, one of our shareholders, is here. I wasn't sure if anybody else was, but thank you for being here as well. So again, please share your comments via chat. We'll give you a chance to ask questions a little later in the broadcast. So if you please be capturing those as we go, I'd appreciate it. I'll open that up later. And let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so Dr. Dietz is a psychiatrist and criminologist. He founded the Threat Assessment Group in Newport, California, and it's the world's first company devoted to workplace violence prevention. TAG has trained and served many Fortune 500 companies, and I told you that he's been come into several that I've worked for, and he helps them with threats of domestic violence, stalking, and disruptive behavior. He's best known to the public as an expert witness who's evaluated some of the top criminals in history, including John Hinckley, Jeffrey Dahmer, Jared Loughner, etc., and dozens of other high-profile criminals. He's a pioneer in the study of threats, stalking, mass murder, and serial murder, and he was educated at Cornell, Johns Hopkins, and the University of Pennsylvania, and is taught at Harvard Medical School and the University of Virginia Law School, the School of Law and Medicine, and UCLA, David Geffen School of Medicine. So highly qualified, highly experienced, and he's got some really interesting things to say. Okay, so to begin, Dr. Dietz, why don't you give us a little bit of your background and how you decided to become an entrepreneur? We'd like your backstory, please.
Well, the backstory really begins by my becoming a physician to meet family demands. My father and grandfather were physicians, and I grew up being taught that there was nothing else one should aspire to. I was taught nothing about business, nothing about any other profession. Medicine was the one and only career path that was deemed appropriate. But I had an experience in high school that made me wonder whether medicine was the right place. And it was that a friend of mine, a young woman, confided in me when we were 15 or 16 that she had been raped over the summer by a guy I knew. And I already knew that this guy was bad news. I didn't know the word psychopath yet. But this was the first guy selling switchblades, the first guy selling booze off the back porch, the first guy promoting exchange of porn among the kids. He was a very bad guy. I don't think she ever reported it to the police. I'm not sure if she ever confided it to anyone else, but it haunted me how much harm he had done to her. And it interested me in crime and what can be done about it, and why people don't get punished and why they don't get help before the crime. And it was really a marker that led me later, as I was recognizing the various courses one could take in medicine and the various pathways one could take, to think maybe I should be a criminologist rather than a physician. And this was a family crisis, of course, that I might not go to med school. But I found a solution, which was to combine medicine and criminology through forensic medicine. And that led me to study forensic pathology and forensic psychiatry. And I realized I could do more good preventively in psychiatry than in pathology. And so my first job was as a young Harvard professor trying to run a hospital for the criminally insane. And I was prepared to work in hospitals, but not among such dangerous people. So
Wow.
That was a learning experience. But one of the things I learned there, germane to the topic today, I discovered quite readily how injuries were occurring to both the patients and the staff at the hospital. And I went excitedly to the superintendent to tell him what had to be changed to reduce injuries. And the next day, some of the correctional officers cornered me and told me in no uncertain terms that my idea was a terrible one and I'd pay a price if it were implemented, because they were counting on workers' comp equivalent leave when they got injured. So they took turns doing the injurious activity in order that one guy could take advantage of hunting season, another hockey season, another
Holy
fishing
smokes.
season.
Oh,
So the incentive structure was all wrong. And as I continued to try to develop preventive strategies in the public sector, I found that there was perverse incentives everywhere you look. I tried also in schools later and found there too, there were barriers to keeping the children safe. The one place that was willing to actually listen and try to keep their people safe was corporations.
very good. Makes sense, right? That we have a huge interest in that, an economic one, right? If nothing else. All right, so you're an expert in violence in the workplace. Can you tell us about some of the more notable cases you've been involved with?
Well, you know, we've been doing this for 33 years of preventing violence in the workplace. And it's hard to believe, but our batting average is perfect. There is
Wow.
no case in which we've ever been asked for advice on what to do before the tragedy when anyone got injured. 100% have been successfully managed. Where we do learn how things go wrong is from another business I operate called Dietz and Associates that provides expert witnesses in litigation and criminal cases. And there we see one after another horror show where people did everything wrong and someone got killed or many people got killed. So some of the workplace cases I've worked on of that sort were a mass murder at a Xerox facility in Hawaii, a mass murder at a manufacturing plant in the Carolinas. There's a long list of them.
Sure.
But I think it's a mistake to even dwell on the mass murder cases in the workplace, because that's not the big problem. That's the newsworthy problem. But it's not the one that is causing the most harm or the most economic damage to corporations.
So what are the ones that cause the most economic damage from your perspective?
Well, if we look at the data about how many incidents of what kinds occur, and these data are few and far between for anything except the most serious cases, it's very clear that many more people are injured physically and suffer serious damage from assaults, robberies, and rapes in the workplace than from mass murder in the workplace. Even ordinary murder in the workplace has come under fairly good control, by which I mean only to say that the numbers have decreased during the time we've been studying this and the time for which data are available. But where we don't have good national data, we've sought data from our clients to look at how many people experience non-injurious harms, non-physically injurious harms, as a result of harassment and stalking and domestic violence that intrudes into the workplace, even if there's no known physical injury within the workplace. And those numbers are astronomical. And to take one example, if one looks at productivity of women who have been physically abused, not only is the productivity of the abuse survivor who's in the workplace reduced dramatically, 30% reduction minimum, but so too is the productivity of at least an average of 2 coworkers. In other words, having a female employee who is being victimized at home costs one the salary and benefits of a full-time equivalent. That's extraordinary.
Yes,
Now,
it is.
we've done the best one can do with quite limited national data estimating costs. And at a minimum, an effective program that deals with threats, harassment, domestic violence, and addictions can save an employer $1 million per 1,000 employees per year.
Wow. Wow. When you say it's prevalent, how prevalent is it?
So this depends on which particular problem we're talking about. Of course, for domestic violence, the prevalence is very high. So we're talking about a substantial fraction of the employed population for women and a lesser but still substantial proportion of the population for males. And that's just one of the many problems. If you add bullying and harassment and cyberstalking and cyberbullying and threats, you're talking about serious problems occurring in any sizable workplace every single day. Now, this of course depends on how many employees there are.
Right.
Many of our clients are multinationals who have 10, 20, 100, 200,000 employees. And so the costs to them are sky high. And they tend to try to do something about it and to prevent occurrences. But unfortunately, many of them got suckered into spending their resources on doing training for active shooters instead of training for how to prevent harms to people. And so active shooter training became quite popular over the last 20 or 30 years, but it's the wrong training. We do that. We have training products on the same general topic, though we call it armed attack training because it's silly to focus just on firearm attacks when it can be poisons and vehicles and edged weapons and blunt instruments and the other things that have been used to kill coworkers or even do mass murder and explosives.
Wow.
So that's become quite mainstream to do some kind of training for what to do when the attack's in progress. What hasn't been sufficiently mainstreamed is how to treat people properly so they don't do this, and how to be able to detect problems long before anyone's hurt.
Okay, I want to hear about that. You told me once that HR people and security people inside companies often react the exact wrong way and they escalate things. So I am interested, what kind of training is needed? And then how can you tell when you've got a volatile situation developing?
Two different questions. So
yes,
the first issue is what not to do. The most common mistakes that used to be made by everyone and now are only made by the uninformed. Calling the police when it's not appropriate is mistake number one. Now, when is it appropriate? If someone has a weapon right now, that's a police call, that's 911. If someone is not threatening with a weapon right now today, there's time to pause and think, how do we really solve this issue rather than jump to call the police? And the reason calling the police prematurely is problematic is that as soon as that's done, you lose control as the employer and you lose most of your options for a safe resolution. Instead, you're left with an angry employee, maybe a humiliated employee, an employee who knows who called the police, and an employee who isn't going to forgive you for embarrassing them in front of their coworkers or their neighbors or their family when the police come to interview them. So that's highly problematic. First, get advice on what to do before calling the police, unless it's a 911 emergency. Second most common error is getting a restraining order. Now, there are, in most places, two kinds of protective orders or restraining orders or peace bonds that one could get. One is for the individual who's being victimized. The other is for the company. Most states jumped on a bandwagon to pass legislation that allows a company to apply for a corporate restraining order. We have never seen a single case anywhere when that was a good idea. And yet many companies do it because their employment lawyers figure that's a tool in their toolbox, so they use it. But it backfires 100% of the time. It's not a good idea. It was a stupid thing for legislators to enact. What do they know about this? So just because the tool's there doesn't mean it needs to be used. Individual restraining orders are a problem too. And the reason individual restraining orders are a problem is that it angers the person against whom it's taken out. It tells them they can't visit or call or send emails or have any contact. Well, which would you rather your harasser, stalker, or crazy ex do when they want to convey to you why you need to die or why you should return to them? Do you want them to email you, call you, or show up in person? Restraining orders make it more likely they'll show up in person because the cost of the violation is the same for all three transgressions.
Oh, wow. Okay. Okay. I understand.
There's always a better way to handle it than a restraining order. Now, the police will recommend restraining orders because it makes their job easier of arresting a person. But that's often a mistake too. If there's a felony charge to be given, then the arrest can be a great thing in states that still recognize that criminals are dangerous and have a bail system. In jurisdictions like Los Angeles that are eliminating bail, there's no point in having the person arrested because now they'll be even more furious. They'll know who had them arrested and the victim is at peak risk. In general, however, in jurisdictions that actually have law enforcement in place and will arrest felons and lock them up pre-trial, it's worth getting an arrest for a felony, but not for a misdemeanor. Misdemeanor arrests tend to let people be released very quickly and angry. So why do that?
What should people do instead? So give us a sense of the right way to handle it rather than the wrong way to handle it.
So this depends on what your relationship is with the person who's being a problem. And it's hard to describe this in generalities without going quite wrong.
I understand.
If there is a threatening employee, or more to the point, an employee who has violated any important policy, and we'll have to talk about policy for this to actually have meaning. If an employee has violated an important policy or seems to have, step number one is to respectfully remove that employee from the workplace with pay pending investigation. That can be safely done if people do not do it in the wrong way. And there are right ways and wrong ways to have that conversation, as you know. Then one has time to figure out what are our options here? What are the various risks we're confronting? How do we minimize, mitigate all those risks? And mind you, in any kind of case that we get a call about, and we're getting them every day, it's never just one risk. The fact that the person threatened to kill his supervisor doesn't tell us that's the only risk. The fact that a domestic violence victim is screaming at her abuser saying she got a gun and she's not going to take it anymore does not tell us all of the risks that are at hand. Now, that's one fact, and if you just react to that single fact, you won't be covering all the options you need to cover. So instead, we want to do an investigation that allows us to discover what all of the risks are. And that's inexpensive and very quick to do, but it requires that you pay attention to your own employment file, to any prior misconduct that's been documented, to gather documents in a completely quick and unobtrusive way in order to see what are our risks. And often it turns out that the risks are of one or more people being physically harmed, of one or more reputations being destroyed, of one or more people engaging in self-harm, of one or more potential harms to the business. And then we want to see how we can minimize all of them at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think you can see that this requires some special knowledge to achieve well.
Right. And I think there's also this forethought, thinking about it in advance and preparing for it in advance so that you know what to do when you face it.
Oh, yeah. It's critical. I mean, we normally start training with the top. So we want executives, those in HR, if there's a security department, the people who are security management, and their employment lawyer to all be on the same page about what's the purpose of this program, what all are we trying to prevent, who has what responsibilities, and what are the resources available for it. Then only when all of that is done do we roll out a policy that affects everyone. And that policy needs to clearly convey what's acceptable and unacceptable behavior. Often the policies are too narrow. They prohibit physical assaults and they prohibit carrying a weapon in the workplace, but they may not prohibit 20 other things that you need policy tools to be able to address. So we want to make sure the policy is broad enough to cover everything it should, but not overbroad. And we want the policy to provide management with the tools to be able to investigate and to remove people from the workplace and to employ mental health resources when necessary. And that's fairly easily achieved, but many policies are inadequate.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So as employers, as female entrepreneurs primarily in our audience, what kinds of things should we be looking for? One of the things you told me once is that people say, oh my gosh, I can't believe they did this. They were such a great guy or gal. And you're saying, boy, there's a lot of signals before that ever happens. What should we be looking for?
So we teach general employees about 20 things we want them to be reporting if they observe. Mm-hmm. We teach managers a greater number of things in our manager training. And some of them are obvious. Of course, you need to require people to report threats. But you also need to have the means to investigate at a much lower level. So it turns out that it is extremely rare to have a threat occur in a workplace without there having been between 5 and 30 earlier warning signs.
Wow. Wow. Like
but
what?
People haven't been taught those warning signs, don't notice them, don't report them. Mm-hmm. We see threats as a very late stage in a process that could be interrupted much earlier when it's cheaper and safer to intervene. Mm-hmm. And they have to do with what any good employer would expect of their employees. So for example, someone who speaks angrily to the supervisor or behaves in other insubordinate behavior. That's an example of an early warning sign that needs to be addressed. Now, what your audience probably knows is many people are not comfortable with confrontation and tend, when someone is a little bit insubordinate, to look the other way, to not correct it, to not report it, and simply hope, well, maybe their next supervisor will deal with that. Maybe someone else will report it. They don't want to spend the time. Our processes take that decision-making out of the hands of the supervisor who doesn't know how to deal with it and doesn't want to. And we give the supervisor one duty: call HR.
Mm-hmm.
Because HR can be trained how to handle all of this if they learn of it. Unfortunately, what occurs in every part of society is that people wait too long to report or don't report at all.
Mm-hmm.
The workplace can correct that if it trains everyone what they should notice and what they should report.
Can you give us a sense of those kinds of things? I know that you've got an extensive list, but what are some of the warning signs?
Well, I just gave you
Yelling.
insubordination as an example.
Yeah.
And we have a proprietary list of warning signs that this isn't the forum for teaching.
Okay.
The extreme warning signs of mass murder, I've already made public, and did that in 1993 when it became so obvious what the pattern was. And that includes anger, fascination with violence, talking too much about violence, identification with survivalists, military, police, and reading their magazines, collecting their gear, talking about that all the time. Having a chip on one's shoulder and always feeling that one is under excessive scrutiny or being mistreated or treated unfairly. Filing complaints and lawsuits inappropriately, inappropriate communications with coworkers or superiors. These are all extreme warning signs that are late stage. So you don't want to wait till it gets that far along. You want to be able to identify things at an earlier stage.
Right, right.
Now, for domestic violence, the signs are well known. And here the caution is not to have the employer act in an accusatory way or assume they know what the source of the problem is when an employee is exhibiting what may or may not be signs of their being victimized at home. So there's a particular way to have that conversation with an employee when the signs are seen, and one should not leap to the conclusion it's domestic violence, because it could actually be substance abuse or depression or some other phenomenon that's causing an employee to come in looking weepy, to be inattentive to the job, to have bruises that might be self-inflicted rather than inflicted by a partner. One doesn't want to leap to any conclusions here. But we do believe, and have recently produced a new product we're very proud of, that teaches employees how to spot signs in their coworkers, their friends, family members, and themselves, and what to do about it if they spot those things.
So we've got a question already, and guys, go ahead and start putting your questions in. I'll pepper both the ones I have and the ones you're coming up with here. So Lynn Harden is one of our investors, and she says, do you work in elementary, junior, or high schools?
We used to, but we found that they were unreceptive to doing things in the right way and in the safe way. There are a lot of barriers to schools handling this properly. They tend to be rule-bound and rigid. They tend to be constrained by some unwise laws and some union regulations, and they don't have the flexibility to do the right thing. They also can't, in most instances, properly control entry points or remove bad actors.
Yeah, I remember calling you about a kid my kids went to school with, and we tried to have that discussion. Okay. Let's see here. So how is COVID influencing violence at work and at home?
Well, I don't think anyone really knows yet. There's certainly lots of reason to believe that domestic violence has worsened in the community as a whole because of lockdowns, because one's got no safe haven to go to for somebody who was already being victimized, because of the stressors on that family, which may be resulting in increased substance abuse. Someone may have lost their job. There are lots of reason to expect an explosion in domestic violence rates, but the data don't bear it out well enough because there are conflicting data from various surveys. So mostly what is relied on is data from calls to 911 or from battered women's shelters that show increasing demands for services. But even those are inconsistent data. I think our best guess, where the science can't tell us, is to follow our common sense and our understanding of the dynamics of this phenomenon, and to assume it has gotten considerably worse for any victim trapped at home.
Absolutely. All right. Alyssa Murphy is asking, through the course of your research on violent behavior, is there a warning sign, trait that surprised you?
No, I would not say that any of the warning signs are a surprise. I think what happens that causes people to be shocked when somebody has finally done the deed and has resulted in this myth of he just snapped, that's because they weren't paying attention to the right things. Let me give you a very good example of this phenomenon. Some of the most popular people have a trait known as charisma. Well, for the world at large and for people who watch daytime TV, charisma is a fascinating, captivating trait. It's seductive. Everybody likes a charismatic person and particularly if they find them physically attractive as well, charisma is a big draw. Well, in my world, I learned early on, observed, that charisma is a warning sign. If somebody's charismatic, do not go on a date with them. Do not take them into your home. And whatever you do, don't send them money. Yet people don't have this in their library of how to behave. And so they keep getting caught up with charismatic people that do them harm. So be careful about those who are too charming, too charismatic.
Absolutely. I knew one early in my career, and I knew who this person was and still felt myself being reeled in. It's very interesting.
Yeah, any of us can be suckered by the right, charming, charismatic person.
Okay, very interesting. So let's see here. So what criteria, when you're talking to employers, do you use to triage a situation and how lethal it potentially is?
Well, first of all, the initial triage is typically done by a well-trained employer so that this is not mysterious. They really fall into a couple simple groups. Group number one is, this is an immediate life-threatening emergency and we have to call 911. And that would be somebody waving a weapon around right now, somebody standing on a ledge. If there's immediate risk of harm to self or others, that's a 911 call. Next category is any of the warning signs, but violence hasn't happened yet. That means you've got 24 hours to figure out what to do. You may or may not want to remove the person from the workplace today. You probably want to remove them if it's a policy violation and more than one person observed it. But if only one person observed it, removing them today could burn that informant, and you don't want to jeopardize them. So step number one is put the right people together to discuss what do we do immediately. And the immediate steps should be decided on typically by an executive in a smaller company, by HR, security, and legal in a big company. And one of those questions is, do we want to bring in an outside expert? And sometimes it's yes, sometimes no. And then the third triage layer is, this is a non-employee, a customer, a correspondent, someone we don't even know, an anonymous communication. Typically, those do not have urgency, and you may or may not have any internal capacity to analyze that kind of information, because typically you've got very little to go on. And the volume of these depends heavily on the industry and the nature of the business. So to give you an example of in that third category, a consumer product company that sells products to millions is going to have lots and lots of complaints and inappropriate calls to their 800 numbers that are given on their product packaging. Many of those inappropriate callers pose no risk of harm to anyone, but some of them may be extortionists or disgruntled shareholders or people who could pose a risk. Now, how do you sort one from the other? I give you an example of the problem of this sorting. This was a case where I participated in the litigation. There was a man who got it in his head that a particular company's products were causing immense harm because they were creating fake Aryans. He had the delusion that there was a conspiracy to produce artificial Aryan-looking people. And the chief perpetrators of this terrible crime against humanity were hair colorists and the makers of tinted contact lenses.
I'll be darned.
Pardon me?
I said I'd be darned. Anyway, go ahead.
And plastic surgeons who did nose jobs, because that could make a Marilyn Monroe type out of someone who wasn't really Aryan at all. And so he resolved that to combat the evil of the fake Aryan cosmetics, he would strike at prime targets. He did, in fact, enter a hair salon in San Francisco where he killed a hair colorist who had a big reputation. He then tried to kill a plastic surgeon in Chicago. I can't recall now whether he hit his target or not. And then he did try to kill an executive at a company that made contact lenses that were tinted, but he missed. He tried to do it from a moving bicycle, and he went underground. Now, nobody had caught him. There were no suspects in the case. And in order to continue his quest, he got a job with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, where he worked for years trying to see through government databases who the big players were in the industry. Then he bought stock in the company that he thought was the biggest offender and arranged to go to the shareholders meeting where his plan was to kill the board of directors.
Oh my gosh.
Now, the only warning, literally the only warning anyone got directly from him was that he sent a postcard to the pharmaceutical company that owned the cosmetic company saying, stop making your fake Aryan cosmetics.
Holy smokes.
So
wow. I mean, the things you must have seen. Go ahead.
We have thousands and thousands of these stories. But the extraordinary thing is, how is a company supposed to pick out that postcard from 10,000 pieces of mail a day, or today, thousands of calls or emails a day, or form submissions on their website. Now, what most companies in the past did is throw it all in a box called nut mail or throw it away. That's not adequate, because sometimes they tell you very clearly what they're going to do. So the true triage problems arise in companies with large volumes of communications and no trained staff on how to screen them or manage them.
So what kinds of plans should employers have in place?
The most basic things that have to be done by any employer are, first, to have clarity about who gets a background check, what kind of background check, and how you're going to do this 100% of the time. Who you hire makes an enormous difference. And one of the most common kinds of lawsuits that arise from workplace misconduct have to do with claims of negligent hiring. It becomes indefensible if you're in an industry where most people do background checks and you don't do it. And you need to find out what other people in your industry do. Do they do the inexpensive one that's a one county check, or are they doing a national check? How many different websites are being searched, and how well are they being searched? So there are cheap, expensive, and everything in between background checks, and you should be doing the right one for your industry and for the type of position. Second thing is to have in place policies that allow you to recognize and deal with inappropriate behavior. And that requires looking beyond weapons and threats as the bad behavior. They're just the tip of the spear. You need to look much deeper than that and have policies that will allow you to address all sorts of behaviors that fall well short of being an obvious violence risk. The third thing is training. And the most important group to train are the decision makers. Once they've been properly trained, they will immediately recognize the value to them and everyone else of training managers and training employees, because it will keep everything safer, have behavior that is more respectful every day to everyone, and will save a fortune in the long run. The cost of putting in a full program is far less than the cost of a single incident occurring, and far less than the cost of maintaining an unruly workplace. And there are solid bottom line gains to be made from doing this properly.
Okay. All right. So we've got some listeners that have questions here. Let's see here. So how do you tell the difference? This is Debbie Flaming, also one of our investors. How do you tell the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath? These terms are often used interchangeably, but are they the same thing?
No, here's the history of this terminology. There was a word in psychiatry called psychopath that referred to a particular pattern of behavior with lack of conscience being a big part of it. No morality, no conscience, no empathy. That term was considered quite scientific and rapidly accepted because the earlier term had been moral imbecile.
Oh, no.
So we replaced moral imbecile with psychopath, and that worked for a while until Hollywood bastardized the term by portraying drooling monsters as psychopaths, and it never meant that. So to get away from that, psychiatry adopted the term sociopath to mean basically the same thing, but with a little twist, because this arose in an era when there was the romantic notion that people were rebelling and that rebellion was good. And so diagnostic criteria were entered to make it sound like a sociopath was somebody who had no fixed plans, drifted from place to place, didn't like authority. Those were part of the concept. Then that got replaced by a very objective construct called antisocial personality disorder with quite clear criteria, and that's what we use in psychiatry today. But psychology has become very involved with the term psychopath once again because of the work of Robert Hare, who points out a particular personality style, much like the old psychopath traits, but now he's measured it, and he's got a very good tool for measurement that's widely used in research. So I realize this is all confusing, but we're talking about people whose primary characteristic is that they behave badly again and again and again under any of those names. You don't want to hire them, you don't want to marry them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. What's going on in my mind as you're talking is the whole ADA constraints around mental health. From an employer standpoint, you got to watch it.
No protection for psychopaths. And the day there is, it's time to leave the country.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. All right. Any other questions, guys? Let's see here. I'll ask some of mine and then go ahead and put yours into either the Q&A box or chat. Let's see here. Preventing violence to kids. Do you have any insight on that? Back to the schools not being responsive. I had kids going to school and one was threatened. What can we do as parents?
Yeah, this is a giant problem. And it's a problem that public schools will not solve for parents. Every story I've heard about concerned parents trying to get an appropriate response from the public school mirrors our experience trying to help public schools. They don't or can't do this properly. So if your child is bullied at school, complaining to the school will probably not result in an effective solution, yet I think it's the correct place to start. There are only 3 effective solutions I know of that a parent can do themselves. One is to put the child in a better school. Remove the child from the school where the bullying is occurring and put them someplace where that doesn't happen. The second is to homeschool the child. And the third is one that no teacher will ever approve of, and audiences always have many people who disapprove when I say it, but it's what I taught my elder son when he was being bullied at school, which is I showed him how to throw one good punch and told him that the next time the bully was shoving and pushing him, he should hit him as hard as he possibly could, right in the nose. If he got in trouble at school for it, we'd deal with it, but he'll never get bullied again. It worked. But of course, that horrifies many people.
My husband would support what you're saying.
I'm sure he would. But you know, it's good for the bully and it's good for your kid to stand up for themselves. But this is not allowed in public schools today.
Absolutely. All right. Any other questions? We had a question earlier. I don't want to politicize, get on one side of the fence or the other. But one of the other things, when you were talking about charismatic people, that was brought up. And do you find more politicians than not are charismatic, or some of these people that you're concerned about?
Well, I certainly am not trying to say that politicians are psychopaths. I know there are people who think that, and in some cases it's no doubt true, but in psychiatry we don't diagnose people without an examination, and we shouldn't. I do think that the trait of charisma proves useful to politicians, and that it is associated with their feeling too powerful and beginning to be corrupted by that power. So I'm suspicious of it in politicians too.
Well, and the other thing that's occurring to me as senior leaders, sometimes people get promoted because they are charismatic. And so you've got a risk of having those people at the top of your company.
Absolutely. We had a case in which a horrible employee who had burned the car of a woman who rejected him, who had abused multiple women in his personal life, multiple women in the workplace, who had engaged in every manner of bad behavior, threatening his supervisors again and again, threatening to kill them if they reported him for what he did. This guy was playing golf regularly with top executives because he was a good golfer and was charming. So everyone was afraid of him retaliating and afraid of his good standing with the executives. When finally a threat was made that couldn't be ignored and someone told security, they asked us to figure out what to do about it. And it was pretty complicated. But what we were able to discover quite rapidly was that he had taken family leave for a time at which he was actually in jail for an unrelated crime.
Oh, wow.
Violating the company's policy that you must report when you are arrested or convicted of a crime. And on that basis, his fraud and using FMLA, we were able to have him terminated without identifying any of the witnesses whom he threatened to kill if they ever reported them.
Wow. Wow. All right. Well, we're running out of time, so I want to give you a chance to wrap up here. So at the end of the day, what would you most like us to have learned from you?
Well, number one is to not wait until there are threats before seeking counsel on what to do about a case. Number two is don't assume that common sense that you might get from your employment lawyer or your friend down the street is the right idea, because there's technical background to take advantage of in handling these things well. Number three, have on speed dial someone who's able to actually help you with this sort of thing and has the right background to do it. We have in our firm retired FBI profilers, retired FBI interview specialists, psychiatrists, psychologists, and we use all of these skills in trying to manage cases for our clients because it's no one discipline that's got a lock on this.
Okay. All right. How about the actions you think we should take? So you kind of gave us an idea of them, but if you had three things you say, go do these things. If you're going to do nothing else, do these things.
Straighten out your hiring policy, background checks, interviews, reference checks, so that you're doing that properly. Have a policy in place that reflects a current understanding of the various kinds of disruptive behavior and inappropriate behavior in the workplace, and get trained.
And how can we do that? I'll give you a chance to talk about TAG and what you do from a training standpoint.
So our training programs include webinars that people from various companies can attend. We have one coming up in April. They include in-house training where we fly in or do online virtual training for the right players at the company in the disciplines I mentioned. We license training products for the people who manage these cases, for the managers and supervisors generally, for employees generally, and for employees who deal with the public, because each of those audiences has different things they need to know. So we do live training and lots of virtual training.
Okay, and what's your website?
www.taginc.com.
Okay, perfect. All right, so anything else you want to add? Any other final words of wisdom before we close up the program?
Well, one thing we didn't talk at all about is how executives become the target and the protection of executives. But, often anger flows upward and resentment flows upward. And the things that are most important for executives to consider, and this is a whole other course actually, pay attention to who knows what personal information about you. Pay attention to who you ever let in your home or near your home. For executives, many of the risks arise because of entertainment at the home, because of their kids' friends, and because of household personnel, the gardener, the housekeeper. All of them have a cousin or an uncle who's a criminal. I don't mean those particular fields. I just mean everybody can have a cousin or an uncle who's a criminal. So if they are in your home and see that you have things they don't have and tell their cousin or their uncle, you have risk. When your kids bring home bad kids who are in their friendship network, one of those kids is going to break in to steal liquor. So all of these personal relationships create vulnerabilities. And if one's attentive to who one lets in one's personal life and in one's home, one can reduce those vulnerabilities. In the workplace, it's very good if there is some means by which the executives can lock the door to their office when they want to. Not against open door policies. You just need a way to have a barrier when you need it. And to be able to have a locked door on command is a step in the right direction. You also need to pay attention when you've got hostility directed to you, to how you get from your office to your vehicle or your transportation, because that's a big point of vulnerability. You're far more likely to be attacked in transit than in your own office. In fact, a colleague of mine was killed going from his office to his car. That's the height of vulnerability. And so one needs to be attentive while going between building and vehicle. One needs to be attentive when driving about who's following, particularly if you have an active threat case at the moment. I've had many over the course of my career and have learned the hard way how to do these things, invented some of the techniques just because of personal experiences. And I see how hard it is for people to live safely. And at home, you need to use your security system, turn it on, not just assume it'll help you even when it's not activated. So simple steps can do a lot of good.
Okay. Perfect. This has been amazing, Dr. Dietz. I'm so grateful to you. Thank you very much for being here today. I appreciate it. Thanks
for inviting me, Donna. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. All right. So thank you again, everyone, for being here today. We've got to close up the program. I just want to remind everyone that on December 18th, we're going to have a virtual holiday party with an ugly sweater contest. So I hope you can make it next Friday. This is networking. We're trying to give you a chance to get to know each other. On the 25th and the 1st, obviously, those are holidays, so we won't be having a program. And then on January 8th, we've got Claudia San Pedro, the president of Sonic, and that's going to be a terrific show. So I hope you can make it. Please sign up for a directory listing at pursepower.com if your company has a female CEO or president or is half owned by women or has at least 20% women on their board. Please do download the Google Chrome extension on your Google Chrome browser and use it to find and buy from women-owned and women-led companies. We hope that you will like and share these media pages, and we will post this video from Dr. Dietz. I think you ought to share it far and wide, particularly HR people that are on the call. Share it with your organizations. You can find these videos at pursepower.com/coronavirus. And then please let your friends know about this webcast we do every Friday at 10 Central. So once again, Dr. Dietz, thank you so much. And I hope you have a
Thank you,
wonderful
Doc.
holiday.
You too.
Thank you. All right. And remember, everybody, purse power, we have it. Let's use it. Take care. Have a great weekend.